the motivation behind putting in this wheat project was that the Lamont Christian Reformed Church wanted to redo its organ, and it didn't have the money to do it at the time, so the church decided to have many of its farmers that could put in a wheat project. And so Jake Stroven apparently was able to negotiate rent on the old Elmer Horton farm, which was 80 acres on the King Road or 72nd and Hayes, and they put in this wheat project to help support the redoing of the organ. I think that tells it pretty close.
Yeah, that's pretty much the case. The organ needed repairing, and at that time there was a movement to get electric organ, but some of them felt that the electric organ never could replace a good pipe organ, so the pipe organ needed repairing, and that's what the purpose was, to repair the pipe organ, which was accomplished.
My twin brother and I biked up there to see it, because that was very impressive to see all that equipment working in the field at that time.
And that was just the beginning of a new era in agriculture. Before that, my dad still had a thrash machine, so we weren't involved with combining.
And my father went there, but he had just what they call a doodle bug, and it wasn't a big enough tractor to be able to work on that kind of ground. My dad just had a small farm on the edge of Lamont, and it was lighter ground, so you could, use a doodle bug on that. He pulled a one bottom 16-inch plow, and on that lighter ground that worked just fine. But he would have never been able to do any good with this heavy ground.
And a doodle bug was a truck transmission with a truck engine or something in it.
Model A motor and a truck transmission and semi-truck tires on the back.
All these years later, what does this episode in farming represent for faithfulness?
Yeah, I would have to say it really represents a church coming together, the people coming together to put in a crop, to do a mission like redoing the organ. And that's an era that's gone by. We no longer will have it, but I think that history really has to respect what these people did back then.
And I think the church held the community together. You didn't buy a farm too far from your parents or your church. You stayed as a community. So you had brothers farming together, and brothers and sisters, or people in the church working together.
Yeah. And when there was a problem, when somebody was sick or whatever, people would step in and help out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the church was more or less the center of our lives as we were young guys growing up. I can remember having catechism on Saturday morning, or for a while we even had it on Wednesday night, I believe.
When I was young, then I would go to catechism Saturday morning and go to my grandma that lived in Lamont for dinner, and then go to Cappy for a quarter to get my hair cut.
Yeah.
But I can remember one morning in catechism from the church, Wilbur Terpstra had a Model T, and I was too young to really get involved, but I was involved. And the older kids would pick up the back end so he couldn't move. The wheels would be spinning, and they'd hold the pickup, or the Model T up. They let it down, and somehow or another I got under it. And he was going back and forth trying to get the kids away, and I was underneath it. And I still can remember my cousin Lawrence flagged him down, and they got me from underneath that Model T for not getting run over.
Yeah, a lot of the history of Ottawa County was really put together by the Dutch.
Yeah.
And their contribution to the county. And even today, I couldn't help but reflect on that as our county commissioners were campaigning this past week. Ottawa County is really the flagship of all the counties in the state in a lot of ways. Sixth lowest in taxes, one of the most productive counties in the state, both from the standpoint of manufacturing as well as agriculture. It's really indicative to what the Dutch did, and they came here in the mid to late 1800s and really made a difference.
Yeah, and then the northeast part of the county was settled by the Germans.
Yeah.
Up in the
Up
Wright
in the
Township, and that's where all the fruit trees are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. My dad came and from the Netherlands. Came from the area of Oosterbeeren and up in Friesland, and I had the opportunity, my wife and I did, of going to the old Oosterbeeren church and standing before in the church where my great-great-granddad, all the way back to Napoleon, when Napoleon came in to the Netherlands, and of course, that was around 1803, but the 4 generations of Hanenburgs were baptized in that church. My dad left there. He was born in 1902, and he left there in 1906. And they immigrated to the United States and came in by the Statue of Liberty. And from there, they went to Wisconsin. And they briefly worked on a dairy farm there, my grandpa did then. And then soon moved to Edgerton, Minnesota, where his brother was, and that would have been Glenn Hanenburg's grandpa. And then they rented farms there, and my dad grew up there. He lost his mother soon after they got here. She died with twins in an accident, and so he was brought up basically just by his dad and his brothers and 2 sisters, which later on they married, and they were all older and they married and moved on. My dad and his brother, actually in the summer of 1916, 1917, in that era, were working on a farm, and his dad would leave on Monday morning and work for the railroad. And he would go up and check the tracks between Edgerton area, Pipestone area, go up towards either into South Dakota or up towards northeast Minnesota. And then he'd come back on Friday night. And this particular summer, he left the boys instructions of what to do on the farm, and they did it. When he got home on Friday night, he said to them, "Boys, I'm going to give you each a nickel, and I want you to go to a carnival that's over at Trotsky, which is about 5 miles from where they lived at the time." And so on a Saturday morning, they each took a horse and they went up to Trotsky with their nickel, and they were instructed to go into this portable jail and meet these 2 old fellows that were in this jail, which they did. And then they saw for the first time a plane fly. And when they got back for Saturday night supper, their dad
saw a plane fly.
saw a plane fly. And then when they got back for supper that Saturday night, their dad said to them, "Boys, what did you learn here?" And he said, "Well, we went and did exactly what you instructed. We went to this portable jail, and we saw these 2 old gentlemen there." And said that they looked like they were pretty harmless, but then my dad said to them, "Look, boys, these 2 gentlemen were young guys, and they came up through here, and they went to Northfield and held the bank in Northfield, Minnesota on a Saturday afternoon hunting season. And they made 2 mistakes. First, you should never steal from something that's not yours. And secondly, they made the mistake of doing it in hunting season on Saturday afternoon when the farmers were in town with their guns." And so a couple of the gang members actually were shot. The rest of them went back to Missouri, and then later on the head of the gang got shot himself. And so these two boys spent their life in jail, and now they're out trying to campaign and raise money to live on with their previous reputation. And the one was Franklin James, the brother of Jesse James, and his cousin Cole Younger. And interestingly enough, the last photo taken of these two guys was in 1918 in a park in St. Louis, and they both died shortly after that. So my dad actually had seen that part of our history in the Midwest. Later on, he came to Michigan, and his brothers were at Calvin College, and so he came to Michigan and bought a small farm near Lamont. He met my mother at Langeland Avenue Church. They got married, and they lived on that farm and raised us 6 kids. So that's kind of a brief history of the Hanenburgs in Coopersville.
See, my folks, grandfolks, came from the Netherlands, the Langelands, and the Strovenjans. My mother was a Strovenjans. My dad was a Langeland. My grandma on the Langeland side, maiden name was Meinersma, and they all kind of lived around Lamont. My dad picked beans for Lily School, or for Lily Farm, and the Lily Farm was on the 40th and Hayes. It was a prosperous farm, a big barn, and a brother had the brick factory in Coopersville, and then when they built that farm on 40th, they used fancy bricks in part of it, and one of the fellows that I know wanted some brick later on in life. He got them. But my dad then picked beans for 10 cents a day. My dad, my Uncle Mike had a motorcycle, Indian motorcycle. My dad was sitting on the back of it, and when Mike got to the destination, my dad wasn't there. And he had slid off the back, and Mike didn't know it. But then on the 4th of July, and I don't know what year it was, but that was my dad was a teenager, he was pulled out of Grand River. He was drowning. Port Fleet brothers saw that he was drowning. They pulled him out of the river, laid him on a barrel, and kind of got the water out of his lungs. And they took him to Coopersville. A half hour later, he still lived. That's how close he got to dying.
Now, what year was your dad born?
02.
Oh, okay, same year my dad was.
Yeah, 1902, and he was born in Lamont. But his uncle was a rich lumberman sawmill in Muskegon, and he would talk about going there because that was his uncle, I guess, would invite him once a year. When they go to Muskegon, he had 5 boys in a Model T, I guess it was. They carried extra water with them, and then when they got to the sand hills, they'd all jump out and push because the old Model T couldn't get up the sand hills, and that's the way it was. And then later when my grandpa got married, he worked for his uncle in Langeland sawmill and lumber, took the first load of lumber into Muskegon Heights, and he was paid by the hour only when the horses were pulling the wagons and stuff. He didn't get paid for feeding the horse or harnessing the horse. The horses and him had to be working when he got paid by the hour.
Yeah. Yeah, both of our dads were elders in the Lamont Church at the time of this harvest, grain harvest. And Uncle John Langeland, as I would call him, lived right across the street. They bought a lot from the Port Fleets and built a nice house when Lester took over the farm. Then your dad moved into that house across the street from us. So we kind of grew up with the Langelands and knew them all well. One of the first jobs I had was actually picking berries and beans for Mike Langeland.
Yeah.
And then later on for Mr. Stayhour.
And you worked for me for a while when you was in high school.
When I was in high school, I worked for Lester and I worked for Glenn Stroven.
Yeah.
Yeah. Learned a lot from those guys. And always very fair, but they expected you to work too. So
Yeah.
a lot of history.
Yeah. And then I took in families from a Bethany home at one time, a young girl.
Yes.
And she,
They lived on the hill farm, right?
yep. Well, then we lived on the Garfield farm because the boy lived in the living room there. And then that daughter that was taken off from her folks by order of court from Bethany home lived with us for 2 years. And that was on the Garfield. And then she went to Lamont Christian, but she was such an outlaw, kind of. The board was thinking of telling me I couldn't send her to Lamont school. But she did, but she'd run away and come home. And
The name escapes me. There was a family that came, I think, from Iowa.
oh yeah, Ikema.
Ikema. That's the name I was going to.
Yeah, they lived in that house after I moved off, but I still owned the house.
Yeah, yeah.
10 kids.
Yeah, big family. And I can remember when I worked for you, you sent me over to that barn. You had chickens in there.
Yeah.
And you instructed me to pitch the manure out of there and clean the floor up. And one of the projects.
And one of the best moves that ever happened to me, I think, business-wise, is I come there one morning for a few years after I moved off, I had my Uncle John Strove, Minersmith, living in the small brooder coop house.
Oh,
He lived there, and he at least watched it and gathered the eggs. Well, he had retired and moved away, so he wasn't there no more. And I come to that farm in the morning, chickens in the water in the basement, hose broke. I met a real estate guy after I got out of there. I was so disgusted. I said, "Can you sell this barn in 10 acres?" And he sold it within 30 days. And but I could keep the chickens there for 6 months because they were young and laying eggs. I took the money and built my first cage layer. And my Uncle John Strovan, I still can tell, my dad telling me, that Uncle John Strovan said, "John, that kid's going to go broke." Because cage layers was a new thing.
Sure.
At that time, I was the first one, I think.
yeah, probably the DeWitts out of Zealand.
Zealand, yep. And,
Yeah.
and I think the eggs went to, first to Hedzer de Young. And he had a route in
Oh,
Grand
sure.
Rapids.
Yes, I recall. Yeah, yeah.
He had his little grading shop right there where the landfill is.
Right where the landfill is, yeah.
And he peddled my eggs for quite a while.
Yeah.
And then eventually I sold them eggs in the Hamilton Farm Bureau.
Yeah.
So and then every 2 or 3 years, I'd add another chicken coop.
Sure. I built a couple of them for you.
First coop had 10,000. I think the next coop that we built had something like 15.
Yeah.
The next one, 30,000. And we had 200,000 there when we finally quit.
Yeah. That's an industry that's really changed too. Wow.
Half a dozen farms in Michigan have all the eggs.
They have all the eggs, yeah. Yeah, one of them's in control of 8 million birds,
Yeah,
the Herbrooks.
yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, I did business with Herbrooks at one time. They had some chickens at my place because something about disease, and they had some extras. I don't know what the deal was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, after you talk about Hedzer de Young, I bought that farm. If you remember PBB, back when that came out with Farm Bureau, then that farm on 68th, right across from the landfill now, was a PBB related farm. And fellow by the name of Walter was on it, and trying to milk way too many cows for what the farm was equipped to handle. And he kept complaining and complaining through his attorney, and he had borrowed his money from Muskegon Bank and Trust, and he kept complaining that he couldn't get his cows bred back for PBB and that type of thing. Well, it turned out there was very little PBB feed ever used there.
Yeah.
Pete Crum had it. Pete Crum had settled with Farm Bureau for a goodly amount of money
Yeah.
back in the day. Then Walter had bought it, and then he was trying to milk 200 cows and 120 free stalls, and and was really hardworking and a good meaning guy, but just too much debt. And he asked me, I had the farm, right across the street on Garfield there, asked me to fill his silos, which I did. And the Muskegon Bank and Trust under Don Pimley had promised to pay me. The bill was $48,000 to fill all those silos. And here it got to be in the spring of the year, and I hadn't been paid yet, and I kept bothering Jerry to pay me, and he said, Mr. Pimley will pay you, don't worry about it. And I said, well, Jerry, the silage is about gone. And this was like late March. And so on the way home one day, I came by, and there was a guy standing right on the side of the road with a blanket on him. What in the world's going on here? For some reason, I stopped my pickup truck, and the guy was asking for a ride. So he got in, and he said, you know what? He says, that farmer just shot all those cattle there. And I says, you're kidding me. He says, no. He says, hey, man, I got to tell you, that's what he was doing. I said, oh, boy, that doesn't sound right. So I got to Eastonville, and I dropped him off, and he was going on his way over to Grand Valley College. I got home that night, and we were sitting at the supper table, and the phone rang, and it was Glenn Stroven. And Glenn called me and said, Ed, you need to know that Gerald Walcher shot all his cattle. And I said, I picked up a hitchhiker who told me that same story. He said, I know that you're on the township board, so maybe you better deal with it. Well, I said, we got a township board meeting tonight, actually, and Art Lucas had just become supervisor. So I stopped there on the way to the township board meeting. That, in those days, we were still meeting in the city. And as I went by, I thought I would just drive in there. And it was spooky. The lights were on in the house. And I drove in there, and there was a half a dozen cows standing around, bleeding and so forth. They were injured. Most of them, like 190 of them were dead. And so I stopped at Preston's gas station, and I called the police, Ottawa County Police, and said, hey, you better get over to 15585 68th Street. There's a bunch of cattle injured. A farmer shot them. I went up and looked into the house. I didn't see anybody around. I don't know what's going on there, but it's not good. And they asked me who I was, and I didn't tell them, and I hung up. And I went to the meeting, and I told Mr. Lucas about it and the board. And, well, if you call the police, there's nothing more we can do right now. On my way home, I pulled in there, and not a thing had happened. Everything was just the way it was. And so I went right back, and I called the police, and I said, I called you at about 6:45 and told you what happened on 68th Avenue. A farmer shot all those cattle. Now I got to tell you, somebody better get over there right away, or I'll call the state police. And I was in Preston's gas station. Within 5 minutes, I heard sirens coming down the road, and they pulled in there, and then the police took over, and I asked them why they hadn't come. And they said they thought it was an April Fool's joke, because April 1st I had called. It was April Fool's Day. They didn't take the call serious. And so they finished killing those cattle, and then the township ended up hiring Verplank's Trucking to haul them all out of there and take them to a landfill up by Gaylord, Michigan.
Yeah, because that was a big issue of where they were going to bury them,
Yeah.
because supposedly some people thought they had PBB in them, so you couldn't bury them in Coopersville.
Yep. Hazardous waste.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then later on they auctioned that farm off. And incidentally, Muskegon Bank and Trust did pay me. I went there hat in hand and said, guys, I'm on my way to court. You had promised to pay me. You're a quasi-public institution. And they ended up paying me the $48,000, and Mr. Walcher ended up signing the farm over to them, and they auctioned it off. And I ended up buying it and ended up spending a lot of time cleaning it up, and obviously been there over the years since. So,
But before Walters bought it, there was a fellow, George
George Venema.
Venema.
Yep.
And as a kid, when he grew up, he worked for a cement company that put in what we call the narrow cement from Coopersville to Conklin, because there was a milk depot in Conklin. And the farmers would bring their milk up by horse and wagon to Conklin. And in the spring, that clay would get so muddy that the horses could hardly pull the wagon through. So they're going to pave it 10 foot wide, that's 3 miles, 3.5 miles. And he mixed the cement by hand. And he said he worked on it mixing the cement by hand. And that cement is still there underneath a coating of blacktop. There's 1 mile of it, they kind of cracked it up. 1 mile they pounded it to pieces, and 1 mile they really pounded it to pieces. So there's 3 different sections, but it all looks about the same yet. But then I was driving on it as a narrow cement yet. Combining in the winter, I was driving my cousin's truck, and you would meet somebody. Both of you had to get off the road, and somehow the other fellow lost control and smashed into the truck. Nobody got hurt, but then later on they added 4 foot on the side, and that road's still pretty decent.
Yeah, it is.
They put another coat of blacktop on it, it'd be good.
So they didn't. I thought back in those days everybody went to Pet Milk here in Coopersville.
That was before that, I think.
Before that already. Yeah, I remember old George Venema. Of course, I bought his house later on, took that down, and
the Pet Milk, I can remember one of the guys, I think my dad's milk went to Pet Milk for a little while. That was kind of low-grade milk. Grade A milk went to Grand Rapids to bottle, but then I don't know who it was telling me, well, that 1 10-gallon can of milk, people had butchered the day before, and when they dumped the milk, a heart and tongue flowed out of the milk can too.
I remember when I worked for Glenn, he was on Class A. He had certain standards,
Yeah.
and he shipped. John Potts was the guy that hauled it, and they hauled it to the Pet Milk plant there in Coopersville. Of course, today Coopersville takes in a lot of milk.
But then that Pet Milk burned down.
Yeah, yeah.
And
It became Independence after that.
yeah.
And you guys still ship.
My dad sent to dairy in Grand Haven, which went broke, but my Uncle Sam sold to Lincoln Park Dairy.
Lincoln, right on the Comstock Park.
Yeah, but the owners of it lived on in Chicago Drive, I think. And one of them boys at my age just died recently, Smith.
Yeah, the Smiths.
But that's kind of family history.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know how many people want to hear that part of the story.